We've now come to one of my favorite parts of this missions philosophy, which is the practical part, our process evaluating prospective and current missionaries. So really, all this document is practical in some ways, but after kind of the bedrock and the foundation of the earlier few pages of the philosophy of missions, laying out the purpose and the goals of why we're doing what we do, then we move on toward the middle part of the document, and now we head toward kind of evaluating these missionaries. And I'd like to go back for just a moment, Carney, and give a little background about how I kind of visited churches and how I raise support, and in general, how many missionaries still raise support today. We have the term deputation. Deputation typically is used to describe the process that missionaries take to raise the support that they need on the foreign mission field that they are going to. So for my particular denominational background, it would be more of a Reformed Independent Baptist type of background, as opposed to maybe the Southern Baptist, where they would generally kind of put all of their funds into a big pot, and then they would support their missionaries so that they don't necessarily have to go out on deputation. There's some advantages to that. They wouldn't have to spend months and years on the road, but then the intimacy factor with a number of churches is kind of missing. The downside to deputation as far as visiting a number of churches would be several. One would be it can take a very long time. I mean, I remember going out, I was single, so I had some advantages there. And I said I wanted to raise support basically in 3 months or so and then be on my way. And I had a number of mission boards actually laugh at me about that. Sometimes it can take 2 to 3 or even more years to raise support for the family that's going to the foreign field. And then there's the downside of just traveling so much and not really getting to know the churches. You have a person showing up at a church, showing a PowerPoint presentation, maybe on a Sunday evening, a Sunday morning. Who knows if he even has the opportunity to preach, or he'll show up on a Wednesday. And I remember kind of focusing on a different method. I would call churches, some of the churches I knew, and I'd say something like this: "Hello, my name is Paul. I'm going to such and such a field, and here's my information. And I would really love to be with your church as long as possible. I love to preach, but I don't have to preach. I would love to go out on evangelism. I would love to be in your people's homes. I would love to go to shut-ins. I would love to do any kind of Bible study, Sunday school lessons, whatever I can do so that your people can see me and they'll know me and they'll know my strengths and my weaknesses." I felt that worked pretty well. And I tried to stay at the churches as long as I could, even though in some cases, the churches really didn't even know what to do with me. I mean, what is this guy doing here for a week or maybe even 2? I could understand that a little bit, although I often will encourage churches to do that. It's not about quantity of missionaries. Let's not see how many prayer cards we can put on the wall with the little old school pieces of yarn connecting it to that place on the map. It's not about maybe having a braggadocious type spirit that says the sun never sets on all of our missionaries because we have so many, and yet they don't really know their missionaries that well. So I would suggest to churches maybe focus more on quality than quantity. It's not about how many you have, but you really want to know your missionaries as well as you can. And depending on the size of the church, that might depend on how many missionaries you support. But when I look at a philosophy like this, I think this is just as good, perhaps an even better way to get to know your missionaries. Not just meeting with them and hearing them preach and watching how they evangelize and seeing how they sit across from a 90-year-old lady in the hospital that they've never met before. Is there going to be sympathy in that missionary's voice and in the questions that they ask? I mean, those are things that I'm really looking for in a missionary. But this missions philosophy now has questions that is actually going to draw out of that particular client that we're looking for lack of a better term. So let me just break it down. You broke it into calling, character, conviction, commitment, and competency. These are questions that you're going to be asking the missionaries. So let me just start, Matt, with number one, the calling. And you're trying to gauge, is this prospective missionary actually called to missionary service? And you have a line in there that says, are they running away from something or being driven to something? There's something behind that phrase. We even had some in bold and italics. So unpack that a little bit and what you're looking for.
Yeah, so we're looking for men who have been called by God to do something that only they can do by the power of God. We're not looking for men that are looking to establish a career. We're not looking for men who are looking to change a career. We're looking for men who want to give their life in service, to die for the Lord in service for Him, because there's nothing else they can do. They're compelled by the conviction that the lost need the gospel. They're compelled by the conviction that the Word of God is sufficient to bring the power of the Spirit of God through the Word of God in the regenerating, bringing new life to the heart. We're looking for men who have been called by God, that they can't do anything else but this, and they're driven by the need for it. It's not just a calling, but a conviction as well. And so, yeah, we're trying to discern, is this person, has he failed at his job? Has he failed in this area of his life? And so now he's throwing his hat into the ring of missions. He, failed as a college student or whatever, and somehow he thinks, I'll do better as a pastor, I'll do better as a missionary. Personally, I've seen that multiple times throughout my years in ministry, and obviously that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for men who have understood that there's nothing else I can do. There's nothing else I want to do, in the sense of this is my life, and trying to discern that. And that really flows out of 1 Timothy 3. I mean, 1 Timothy 3 is really the impetus for this. He that desires has the aspiration, has the strong, compelling desire for the task of eldering. He desires a good thing. And I believe that desire is a gift from God. I believe that's the first qualification of a called man, is he has that desire for the task, not for the position, not for some elevated status, but for the work of the ministry. And that's what we're looking for.
Okay, so if I could pause you there for a moment, come over here to Tom, because you said 3 times, I can't do anything else. Now that could be misconstrued. That might be, people could misunderstand that. I want to come over here to Tom for a moment, because you would say that phrase not only for missionaries, but for pastors. Absolutely. You would say a pastor can't do anything else. I want to come over to Tom here, because you're sitting next to your pastor here, and I think you'd say there's a sense in which your pastor can't do anything else, but of course there's a sense in which he can actually do lots of things. Could you help us understand that phrase when a man says, I can't do anything else but be a pastor, I can't do anything else but be a missionary? What exactly does that mean?
Great question. In the context of calling, when someone says, I can't do anything else, that's not a cop-out to say that, this is my last option. No, what that is, that's an insatiable desire to please God in what God has impressed upon their soul. So I'm not satisfied unless I'm going to be fulfilling this calling of God in my life. I can't do anything else. I can't sleep at night if I don't go out and preach the gospel, plant churches, whatever that particular missionary's calling is. And so I think that to understand that, and that's exactly what we want to look for, is that it's not I'll throw my hat in the ring. This sounds like something really cool. That's romantic to go to a foreign field and do missions. And so it's that desire that burns within the soul that only is satisfied when they do God's will.
What would that look like for Matt? In what sense actually could he have done a number of things, and yet there was as Jeremiah said, a fire in his bones, and he was weary with forbearing, and he could not stay?
So that the beauty of that is that I was on the elder board that called Pastor Matt into ministry. And so I sensed early on that this man has a really unique ability to proclaim God's word and to hear him say such a, like, there's nothing else that I want to do other than to shepherd a church. And so you start to see, you listen for those points of interest, or the points that come out that clarify his calling as a pastor. You look for those words. And I could easily see, as he talked about leadership, as he talked about wanting to pour his life into people, that shepherd leader ability came out within that conversation. And we can see this is a man of God that we want to call as our pastor.
So an example of someone who would fit that bill would be someone who might actually be very gifted in accounting, or they might be very gifted as a mechanic, and yet they can still say, I can't do anything else, in the sense of, I would not have any fulfillment. I could not go forward in peace. Of course, there's one sense in which I can do lots of things. I'm very gifted in X, Y, and Z, but I can't in the sense of, there is a burning in my soul, and I will not be able to sleep and go forward until I obey God's command to proclaim his word.
Yeah, so it's not an ability issue. Abilities come later in the philosophy by way of competency. So we're not talking about abilities where, I can't do math, I can't do language, whatever. We're not talking about that. That's not what the phrase means. It's never that. It's talking about the pleasure. Where is the pleasure of that person found? Where's the contentment of that person found? Where's the peace of that person found? And that's what we're looking for. Does this person find his greatest contentment, pleasure, and peace in serving the Lord? Or is that found somewhere else? And I believe this is paramount. That's why it's number one on the list, because a person that finds his greatest peace, contentment, and pleasure in giving his life to the Lord in this specific arena, it will be one that won't be easily distracted, won't be easily deterred, won't be easily pulled away by other things which we know come in life and ministry. And so the calling of that person is paramount to the commitment of that person. I believe calling becomes foundational to commitment. And that's why I think it's a big deal for pastors, for missionaries, for all Christian servants.
Boti Paul, could I actually just come in here and just say, I've seen this exemplified in your life and in your teammate's life, Boti Seth, in how both of you have this insatiable desire to reach the lost and to reach the Tsongas for Christ. I remember visiting the Myers home, and when you interact with Boti Seth, he's a man of great passion. And he spoke of how, his wife actually spoke of how during COVID, he started getting antsy because he needed to get out and evangelize. He needed to evangelize people. And if you spend enough time with Boti Paul week in and week out, you'll see how around the dinner table, in a random conversation, his mind drifts off to different ideas to reach people for Christ, whether it's going to a village in the middle of nowhere, hanging out by a shop and trying to speak to people, or if it's hooking his trailer up to the back of his Land Rover and driving around the village and picking up every boy who will come and then preaching to them. And so there's a sense in which both of you are good with your hands, you're good with your minds, and you have such determination that you could do many things. But you have this insatiable desire for this thing, this calling that God has given you.
Yeah. And that ties into what you just said, 1 Timothy 3:1.
Absolutely.
That's the first item to get to.
I never wanted to be a pastor. Like, I never had that. Like, that wasn't a goal of mine. I wasn't born, with this calling in that sense. As a teenager, it was never a thought of mine. I mean, we had our own business. We had a thriving business. I was an apprentice as a teenager and learned multiple trades and was set for life by way of making money and providing for a family. And being in ministry was never part of my plan. But as I grew in my understanding of the Lord and grew in my opportunities to serve the Lord, there began to grow in me a fire that literally consumed all those other things I could do and still can do by way of ability. Fixed your oven yesterday, right? It's not that's still there, and I'm thankful for that. But the desire is not there to do those things. Like, I can't not preach God's word. I can't not shepherd God's people. I will die. Like, it would consume me from the inside out. And COVID was one of those things where Tom could tell you, like, I almost died. That's why we didn't go without church very long. I mean, we were only a few weeks because we were all told Armageddon was here and we were all going to die. So we all went our ways to get ready to die, i.e., you know, that's a joke. Yeah. But I mean, it didn't take long where I'm looking at this little, we preached every Sunday. I never stopped preaching. Looking at that little red dot on that camera and telling the elders, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to die. You've got to come sit in the service. This is a joke. And it's that reality. And that's what drove me into ministry. Yeah, and it's because I was trying to run a business and shepherd a people at the same time. And it's like, yeah, this isn't going to work.
So if a young person comes up and says, how do I know if I'm called into missions? There's a number of ways to answer that. But one of the first ways would be, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you desire to?
Tell me about your desire.
And then if they say, how do I know if the desire is there, branching off of what you said, our advice, our counsel would be, just get busy in the church. Serve in as many different things as you can, and eventually the desires will start to leap off a particular aspect.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump to those questions. Let's do it this way. There's probably a dozen or so questions. And so I'm just going to ask you to maybe give 1 or 2 sentences. I'll read one question, and then you just give 1 or 2 sentence feedback of what you were thinking, why you put that question there, what you're looking for. Here's one of the questions. The third one: has your calling to be a missionary ever been tested? For instance, was there ever a time when it was hard and costly to serve God, but you continued?
Yeah, so this gets to the depth of that desire. Is this just something surface? Is it a pie in the sky? Is it a rose-colored idea? Is this person thinking of missions as just like a glorified vacation? You know, so I want to know, does he have a right perspective on what he's wanting to do? And then has he gone through the difficulty? Has he gone through the pressure of that? And I want to see that. And does that desire, is it still there? After you go through the pressure cooker, after you failed, or after you've been rejected, after that idea fell flat or whatever, it didn't go the way you thought. Those people didn't respond to your sermon like you thought they would. I'm going to preach and everyone's going to get saved, right? And they didn't, and they walked away. Do you still have that desire and that love for his word and for the lost to bring the gospel to them?
I sometimes refer to the ETOW experience. If you're not familiar with ETOW, it's a old school New Tribes Mission video that I remember watching as a kid. It's just so inspiring about this group of missionaries that goes to Papua New Guinea. And I think the word ETOW actually means it is true. And they actually spend a long time giving the gospel. And in the end, they basically say, ETOW, it is true. And basically the whole village comes to Christ. And it's inspiring. I'm not opposed to that video, but there might be ETOW experiences that you can just kind of ride the wave on that kind of emotion, and you really haven't counted the cost. And that's what you're trying to look for.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. How does your wife, spouse, family feel about your calling to be a missionary?
Yeah. I mean, you could be self-deceived, right? You could have, again, this idea that you're called to this, but everyone around you who knows you best realizes, hey, yeah, this is not for you. You know, you don't handle the word well, you're not clear, maybe you don't have a holy life, or whatever. And so it is imperative that the people around you that know you best, i.e. fellow Christians, godly people that speak into your life that are supportive of that. And I want to know that. And obviously if you're married and your wife's not on board, that's a massive red flag. That would be disqualifying on every level. And so I want to know that. I want to hear that. I want to hear, is everybody else around you seeing the same thing?
Makes me think of the anecdote of Anthony Norris Groves, great missionary to the Muslims. And he actually married George Mueller's, how can I put this? It was either he married George Mueller's, no, it was the other way around. George Mueller married Anthony Norris Groves' daughter. I think that's the way. Somehow they were related, the two of them. And Norris Groves wants to go to the mission field. He's a successful dentist. His wife doesn't want to go. And he urges her and she doesn't want to go. And he just kept on writing, now's not the time. And they would continue to progress. He would continue to study his Bible, continue to be active in the church as a dentist. And then he would come back and she would break down in tears and say, I can't go 1,000 miles away to the other side of the world and live and die there. And then he'd say, okay, it's just not time. And then eventually he won his wife over and she said, we must go to the mission field. And he said, now's the time. That's what you're looking for, and not a missionary who's dragging his family along.
That was exactly how I ended up in seminary, because my wife does the same way. When we were looking at moving to going to Los Angeles, for her, it was like going to a whole nother world. And we had that conversation, and it literally that was my phrase, now's not the time.
Could I actually ask something here? We were talking yesterday about galvanizing more people and how the numbers are down. And the typical age group who may be thinking about missions and the college age group may still be single people. How would you counsel someone who is single and they're thinking about missions? Maybe they're listening to this podcast and their burden is developing and getting weightier, but the person they have a romantic interest with never expressed an interest for missions before. Does this mean that missions option isn't viable anymore? Is there an option for that person to join them and develop their interest if they never expressed a desire before? How would you think around that?
Yeah, I'd say it's a couple things. One, it may be that person isn't ready, just like we just heard from the historical example that Paul just gave, right? And so it may just be a time factor. It may be that person's not the right person for them, right? And that is a red flag. If that person is called to the ministry and he's examining a potential spouse that is not demonstrating that conviction, that to me would be like, well, then that's pretty obvious that's not the person for me, because I need a helper. Right, that's what a spouse is. A wife is coming alongside to help, and she doesn't have that conviction. And I'm in this phase of looking for that. I think that would be a pretty obvious. Red flag. And then, I mean, without question, that person. The implication is in your question, but it just needs to be said. Would need the counsel of godly leadership in his life, pastors, elders in his life, to help guide him through that and to help counsel him through that know him best and know that situation and potentially even know that other person. But yeah, I mean, if I'm called to this and I'm examining a woman that's not, or doesn't have that desire to support a husband who's called to this, then for me, that would be pretty much the end of the road. Yeah.
Let me just give a couple anecdotes. Many viewed me as an hopeless case when I graduated. I went to a Christian college, probably 2,000 to 3,000 girls, and I graduated single. And the thinking was, if you can go through 4 years of college surrounded by thousands of Christian girls, and you come out single, you're hopeless. So that's why I actually went to the field single and here for 2 years before I eventually married. But one of the reasons for that was it wasn't just, are you interested in this girl? One of the determining, changing points when I started showing interest was, oh, and by the way, I'm going to be a missionary in Africa. And that really was the game changer a lot of times. Yeah. Oh, I thought this one, okay, that's not going to work. And I made it pretty clear early on. And I appreciated their honesty. So that would be one side of it. But then on the other side, I think we might swing too far to the other degree, saying we want a missionary wife or prospective missionary wife to long and dream of the mission field. Ultimately, she's called to her husband. So I've seen a lot of missionary wives who would say things like, I never thought about being a missionary. I never dreamed about being a missionary, but I love my husband and I'm going to be submissive to him and I'm going to follow him wherever he goes. Yep. Hey, that's great for me. But if I see a woman who would actually say, I can't do this, or I don't want this, or I'm opposed to it, that would be where the red flags would come in for me. And you even see that with William Carey, and that actually caused a lot of problems where he was actually, I give him some grace here because he was the father of modern missions, but Dorothy did not want to go to the other side of the world. And William was actually going to go without her, with one of the children, until at the last minute, they made a deal where she said, I'll go if I'm allowed to bring my sister along. And that caused a lot of problems. So you want to make sure that they're at least in union together about their goals for the mission field.
Thank you for listening to part 3 of 4 of this episode. To continue learning how to develop a biblical philosophy of missions, we invite you to join us for part 4 next Missions Monday.